Hello and welcome to another video trying to get you the very top grades. Today I'm going to explain to you the importance of this word contemporary when describing your readers. We're looking at Jekyll and Hyde. These are some of the images that would have been around at the time it was written. We're going to look at three themes. One, the theme of violence and what that had to do with contemporary readers. Secondly, the theme of lies and deceit and what that had to do with those readers, and finally the element of curiosity. And as you've seen in each one, I will be dealing with specific quotations that you can use in your essay writing. Right, let's start off with what the penny dreadful is. So texts were called penny dreadfuls because they were cheap, they only cost a penny, and the idea was that they satisfied the appetites of contemporary readers, and those appetites were towards the gothic, the lurid, through crime and violence and instances of debauchery. That's where characters, real life characters, were carrying out things that their readers could only dream of but knew were socially incorrect. So hopefully you can see the parallel between Jekyll and Hyde. Jekyll dreams of carrying out these sorts of events that would be in a penny dreadful, but he has to create this persona, Hyde, in order to do it for him so that he, Jekyll, does not get ostracized. That means cut off by, ostracized by society. So here we have a story called Black Bess, Knight of the Road. And you can see it's about violence again. It's about robbery. Usually it will include somebody who was formerly a gentleman who has now decided to turn to crime. And you can see the parallel with the kind of story of Jekyll, the gentlemanly figure who is turning to crime in the form of Hyde. Then we have the fact that Hyde gets up to all sorts of stuff that's kept secret from us as readers. Stevenson deliberately doesn't tell us what it is. This allows the Victorian reader to suppose that it is something like this, kidnapping young virgins and having sex with them. Of course, that might not be what happens at all, and if you've watched some of my other videos, you'll know that there is a deeper clue as to what Hyde's sexual activities are. I won't deal with that here. But this is what would have been in the mind of the Victorian reader. And then another thing that is very much at the forefront of their minds is the fear of drug taking, because drug taking in Victorian times was entirely legal. And this led to the creation of opium dens, such as we have here. So imagine a pub with beds, and effectively that's what you've got in an opium den. You'd lie down on your bed, smoke your opium, and it would send you into a stupor of dreaming and unconsciousness for hours and perhaps even days. And although this was legal, it was greatly feared by the Victorians because respectable people could do it. They'd do it in secrecy, and it would take days out of their lives, and they'd gradually become addicted. And this, you can see, has a real parallel with the fear of the creation of Hyde, because he is created through drug taking. You know, if you think of Frankenstein, written in 1819, where a monster is created through the power of electricity, well, that kind of science wouldn't do for Stevenson, because he wants to explore not just science, but the theme of drug addiction, and in particular, the middle class addiction to drugs, because remember, it was legal. Right, one effect of all that drug taking, of course, is the violence. So we could interpret Hyde's violence when he kills Sir Danvers Carew. Couldn't get a picture of Sir Danvers Carew being killed, but I got you another penny dreadful picture. The idea of a gentlemanly man, outwardly respectable look, turning violent and revealing his true self, killing an innocent person, usually a woman, because that was the convention of the time. And if I want to talk about readers who are not contemporary but modern, this is still an image, isn't it? If you think about films, how often is it that these films include female victims? How many times in detective stories or horror films are women ruthlessly killed in a violent way? It's still a stereotype that we have in our current literature. Now, Stevenson isn't just giving his readers what they want. He's not just giving them violence because they want it. He's also deeply uncomfortable about this kind of readership. He's quite critical of this contemporary reader. And so his description of the violence is quite subtle. And when he does describe it, he over-exaggerates. Hopefully you remember the word hyperbole, and he uses hyperbole to show how unlikely this level of violence is. And he does that not just to show how powerful Hyde is as a figure, but also how powerful the desire of the reader is to have extreme forms of violence in their fiction and their entertainment. So actually Stevenson is making fun of his reader in a gentle way and suggesting that they are actually part of the problem. They are addicted to tales of true life violence, and therefore they partly fuel it. Let's have a look at the language to see what I mean. And then, all of a sudden, he broke out in a great flame of anger, stamping with his foot, brandishing the cane, and carrying on, as the maid described it, like a madman. The old gentleman took a step back, with the air of one very much surprised, and a trifle hurt, and at that Mr. Hyde broke out of all bounds, and clubbed him to the earth. And next moment, with ape-like fury, he was trampling his victim underfoot, and hailing down a storm of blows, under which the bones were audibly shattered, and the body jumped upon the roadway. At the horror of these sights and sounds, the maid fainted. So hopefully you can hear in my reading how over-exaggerated the description is. And now if we go deeper and look at how he's over-exaggerating it, you'll see a lot of the comedy that Stevenson is after. And this will help you when you write about different interpretations for the top grade. So initially he describes Hyde as stamping with his foot. That is like a child in a tantrum, and he's pointing out here that Hyde's violence is not very realistic. This would not really happen. It's just fictional. But at the same time, he's pointing out that the desire to see this violence is also childish. He's telling his readership, I'm giving you what you want because you're actually not highly evolved as a human being. You're still stuck in a childhood phase, really interested in getting pleasures from things which are forbidden. Next, he makes a great joke of poor old Sir Danvers Carew, who, instead of being terrified by this childlike stamping of the foot, seems a little bit surprised and only a tiny bit, a trifle, a tiny bit hurt. And then this is contrasted with Mr. Hyde clubbing him, not just to the ground, but to the earth, and using this word earth, which means ground, but also means our whole planet. Stevenson is making fun of our making so much out of violence that we devote in his contemporary times so much interest in this violence, as though it is swallowing up the whole earth. And Stevenson is protesting against this. You know, why, readers, he's asking, are you after this kind of cheap form of thrill-seeking in your fiction? But at the same time, he's saying, I'll give you a little bit of that, but I'm going to make you think more deeply about my other themes, the other themes which are in my other videos. Next moment, with ape-like fury, now he brings in the theme of evolution. And again you can see him criticising the evolution of his readers. Remember, they're like Hyde, they are childish in their interest in violence. And now the violence is completely over the top. So hailing down a storm of blows does sound like an unprovoked attack. But this maid, who is sitting in a window on an upstairs bedroom in a house where she can't hear what the men are saying, can actually hear the bones shattering. Well, that's an over-exaggeration which we might be able to believe, but probably not. This is Stevenson suggesting that our desire for violence is so great that he has to invent implausible violence to satisfy the contemporary reader's need for violence. And then the body actually jumps on the roadway, which is obviously ridiculous. It's a dead body, and no one's going to be able to hit it with enough force to make the whole body lift up off the road as it bounces back under the pressure of the blows. So we get a sense of Stevenson writing for two sorts of reader. One who is unsophisticated and just interested in thrill-seeking, who will respond to this in a similar way to the maid, you know, being full of horror, but delighted horror, like a fairground ride. However, he's also writing for the more sophisticated reader who will look at the language and see through this attack that Stevenson's making on the first kind of contemporary reader I described. Now, this links us, of course, to other forms of attack on the readership. So one of the things that he really dislikes is the ability of middle-class men, and indeed women here because they're the readers, of giving in to lies and deceit. And the most powerful form of lies and deceit are the ones we tell ourselves. You know, that we deceive ourselves as to what we're really like. And he does this through the creation of Utterson. But no sooner was Mr. Utterson alone that night than he locked the note into his safe, where it reposed from that time forward. What, he thought, Henry Jekyll forged for a murderer, and his blood ran cold in his veins. So this is the note that Henry Jekyll has written as Hyde in handwriting which he pretends is Hyde, but which Utterson, through Mr. Guest, finds out is actually Henry Jekyll's. Now, the lie and deceit here, obviously, is Henry Jekyll, who's forging for Hyde, but much worse than that is that this is evidence to a potential crime. It's evidence that Jekyll is covering up for a murderer. And what does the lawyer, who's supposed to be on the side of the law, do? He locks it away in his safe, where it reposed forever. It never came out. He kept it hidden. And this is Stevenson's way of attacking society at large. He's saying, well, society's like this. The law is supposed to protect us, but actually the people behind the law, these respectable men like Utterson, are actually corrupt. And he's accusing his readers of being part of this same establishment that gives in to lies and deceit rather than exposing the truth about their society. If they were more keen on exposing the truth, they would realise that their part in fueling this interest in violence and allowing, for example, things like opium dens to proliferate or gin palaces. So there's one description I haven't put in here where Utterson goes to Hyde's and he finds lots of women drinking gin early in the morning at a gin palace. So Stevenson's really attacking this Victorian morality which allows gin palaces and opium dens to exist. And then finally he wants to get his readers on side so that he can change their view of society. And he does this through every reader's desire to satisfy curiosity. If you're not someone who enjoys reading, then you're not a curious person. You're not someone who's prepared to devote real thought to how the world really is. And one way of defining reading is experiencing the world in other ways so that we can better understand how the world really is. Now, Stevenson plays on this with the idea of the detective genre. So at the beginning, he has Utterson behave like a detective and also think like a reader who is curious. If he be Mr. Hyde, he thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. And yes, there is a little joke in there which makes this a very memorable quotation, but the way to use it is to talk about how this addresses the contemporary reader. The contemporary reader feels like this. They are seeking the solution to the problem of this mystery, of this detective story. But there is a deeper mystery that he wants his reader to understand rather than just who did what to who and why. It is one thing to mortify curiosity, another to conquer it. So here, Utterson is a failure as a reader. He wants to mortify, to kill off curiosity. He doesn't want to find out what Jekyll is actually doing. Instead, he wants to hide it. He doesn't want to find out the truth of the events, and when he does, he hides that as well. So now we have an attack on this middle-class society that is hiding the truth from society at large. And this brings us back to the other mention of the word curious in the novel, which is right at the beginning. But there was one curious circumstance. I had taken a loathing to my gentleman at first sight. These are the words of Enfield when he first sees Hyde, when Hyde has trampled over this little girl. He's just stepped on her once as he's not seen her going through the night. But what's interesting about that encounter is that Enfield and the others at the scene instantly want to kill Hyde. And Stevenson's pointing out here that Enfield and the people around him are far, far worse characters than Hyde at this stage. Hyde hasn't committed any murders here, as far as we're aware. He's committed no crime at the beginning of the book, and yet people want to kill him. Why? Because mankind is inherently interested in violence. But they lie to themselves and deceive themselves about this addiction to violence, which we see here, because Enfield never reflects on the fact that he is far more vicious than Hyde, and the doctor who comes to the scene also wants to kill Hyde. Enfield never reflects that he is also far more violent than Hyde. So he doesn't reflect on Stevenson's main message, which is that we, the readers, are actually just as vile and murderous and full of vice as Hyde is. Now, the reason for that could well be the oppression of society. So if society allowed Jekyll to be curious in following his desire, either for prostitution or for drug taking or for homosexuality, if none of those things attracted the disapproval of society, then people would be able to do these things without fear of being repressed. And this violent scene here doesn't happen because Hyde is innately a murderous character, because he hasn't murdered before. It happens because Hyde has been locked up in solitary confinement for over a year by Jekyll. He's been locked up inside Jekyll when Jekyll refuses to take the drug again to bring him out. So in this way, Stevenson could be suggesting that the real villain of this book isn't so much Hyde, it is society that represses our natural curiosity and makes the things we're curious about seem sinful and describes them as vice. And that forces us into a world where we do things which are immoral, because we have to hide our vices from society at large. And we can add that to the autobiographical detail that Stevenson then, shortly after publishing this novel, left England for good. You know, he rejected this repressive society in order to explore his own curiosity about other societies and other ways of living. So hopefully you now have enough to deal with any essay. You'll be able to take any part of this video and fit it, whatever the theme of the essay, something from here will fit. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.